Good afternoon, colleagues. This is Martin Murphy from the ILO Department of Communication. Hope you're doing well, and welcome to the press briefing on ILO's Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. Convention 182, as you may know, calls for the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including slavery, forced labor, and trafficking. It is one of the ILO's 8 fundamental conventions, and these principles are also covered by the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work from 1998. Today with us we have ILO Director General Guy Ryder. We also have Ms. Vera Paquete Perdigão, who's the Director of the Governance and Tripartism Department at the ILO. And also joining us virtually, we have Ms. Corinne Varga, Director of the ILO's International Labor Standards Department. We will begin with a short introduction by the DG, and then we'll follow with the Q&A. The Q&A will be in English. Just a reminder that the embargo for this press briefing and also for the press release that we shared with you yesterday will lift at the end of the press conference. So that's 1500 hours CET, 1300 GMT. And we'll make the video recording of the press conference available to you at the end of this. So let's start right away. DG, you have the floor, please.
Thank you for joining us, because today is a very special day. History has been made. The Kingdom of Tonga has delivered its formal ratification of ILO Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. And with that ratification, this convention has become the first in the history of our organization to achieve universal ratification. Every one of our 187 member states has now ratified Convention 182. That means that as of today, all children around the world benefit from critical legal protection against the worst forms of child labor, and that, as Martin has said, includes slavery and debt bondage, trafficking, the obligation to participate in armed conflict, children being used for commercial sexual exploitation or in illicit activities, or subjected to hazardous work. Governments have committed to take immediate, time-bound measures to prevent children from being engaged in these forms of child labor, and also to remove and provide rehabilitation to the children affected. And there is a special focus on girls in this regard. Now, the journey up until this point has been remarkable. Back in 1998, the Global March Against Child Labor, led by Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi, culminated with children and adult marchers from every region of the world joining the International Labour Conference in Geneva and called on delegates to produce a new standard. And just 1 year later, Convention 182 became the first ILO convention to be adopted unanimously by delegates at the conference, and it's since become the most rapidly ratified instrument in the ILO's 100-year history. Convention 182 at that time filled a critical gap in the international legal framework protecting children's rights. In the past, it has too often been the lot of children to be used to fight in armed conflict, to be sold as slaves, forced into work in the drug trade or in the production of child sexual abuse material, or exposed to hazardous substances and long hours. In every country, now these practices have been condemned and clear legal prohibitions against them have been established everywhere. As countries align their domestic laws and policies on the worst forms of child labor, there is a global baseline standard of child protection, and these abuses are no longer tolerated anywhere. The campaign to end the worst forms of child labor has become a true worldwide movement. In every region, ratification of Convention 182, as well as ILO Convention 138, which establishes minimum age for employment, has ushered in targeted programs to tackle child labor through education, social protection, the promotion of decent work for adults and for youth of working age. Dozens of countries have developed national action plans on child labour and have mobilised whole of government responses, assigning resources and engaging employers and workers' organisations and civil society in their efforts. Countries have integrated child labour concerns into education sector plans, rural development schemes, poverty alleviation plans, and social protection systems. And they recognise the vital role that eliminating child labour plays in social and economic development. Why? Because child labour perpetuates poverty across generations. It interrupts education, lowers workforce productivity, and condemns the children affected to a lifetime of poorly paid, unstable employment, usually in the informal economy. And the data is very clear. Tackling child labour is not just the right thing to do, it's a good investment as well. Cost-benefit analysis shows that for every dollar spent on child labour elimination, there is a return of $7. Now, Convention 182 requires effective, timely action, but it also requires monitoring impact and accountability. In every region, countries regularly survey child labour, enabling them to establish trends, track progress, and create effective targeted policies. And here at the ILO, countries are held to account for what they do to implement Convention 182 by our supervisory mechanism. Countries report on implementation at regular intervals, and they cooperate with special procedures examining allegations of non-compliance where they arise. And under the ILO's tripartite structure, which brings together employers and workers as well as governments, these complaints can be registered. And we've seen progress, sometimes rapid, sometimes more laborious. For example, when Uzbekistan ratified Convention 182 and 138, that opened the door to ILO monitoring of widespread child labour in the cotton harvest. And that resulted in reductions in child labour year on year until the problem has now virtually been eliminated. Another example is Ghana. Thanks to the ratification of Convention 182 there, the government and social partners tackled child trafficking for work in fishing on Lake Volta, rescuing children working on boats, children who used to have to dive into the lake in very, very dangerous circumstances to free nets caught on submerged timber. Convention 182 also speaks to the need for international cooperation. It requires countries to assist one another to eliminate the worst forms of child labour through enhanced cooperation. And ILO member states have responded, making the ILO International Programme on the Elimination of Child Labour and Forced Labour, IPEC+, one of the largest development cooperation projects in the history of our organisation. And it's also a leader in the worldwide movement against child labour. With generous donor support, IPEC Plus has operated in more than 100 countries. It strengthens the capacity of governments to develop and implement effective evidence-based policies against child labour. It supports the development of legal frameworks aligned with ILO child labour conventions and their enforcement. And it promotes inclusive, universal basic education, social protection, and decent work for parents and children above the minimum age for employment. And this programme has supported thousands of communities in every region to address child labour, to raise awareness, to document and disseminate good practice, and to serve as a global centre of excellence in tackling the abuse of child labour. And widespread and now universal ratification of Convention 182 has been a key part of the important progress that has been made. The 16-year period that began in the year 2000 saw a net reduction of 94 million in children in child labour. The number of children in hazardous work, which is one of the worst forms of child labour, and a proxy measurement of, for all forms of worse forms fell by more than half over the same period. And yet, with this good news, there is absolutely no reason for complacency. Countries must do more to end impunity for violators and for violations of children's right to be free from child labor. And they must address the root causes: poverty, inequality, and social marginalization. The UN Sustainable Development Goal Target 8.7 calls for the end of all forms of child labor by 2025, and we need to step up the pace. Today, the ILO ensures the secretariat of a global partnership, Alliance 8.7, which brings together more than 250 partners to coordinate action on tackling child labor, forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. At country level, 21 Pathfinder countries have committed to accelerate action to look for innovative solutions and to share best practices with all partners to support SDG targets 8.7's increasingly urgent deadlines. But, and this is the crucial figure, there are still 152 million children in child labor, 73 million of them in hazardous work. And regrettably, progress in recent years has slowed. 71% of child labor is in agriculture, and 2/3 of it is in unpaid family work. Progress in Africa, the region with both the highest absolute number and the highest prevalence rate, has stalled. Progress amongst younger children has stopped. And the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to reverse years of progress. And so innovative solutions that address the needs of the most vulnerable during crisis management and, of course, recovery are absolutely key. So, colleagues, the urgent response triggered by the adoption of Convention 182 is needed more than ever. The United Nations has declared next year, 2021, the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. And with the universal ratification of Convention 182, and with the determination to build back better from the current crisis, we have real opportunity and responsibility to deliver on the promise of Convention 182 and put an end to child labor in all of its forms. Thanks.
Thank you very much, DG. We'll now move to the Q&A. I'll ask you to please raise your hands if you want to ask a question, and I'll give you the floor. And also, if you can repeat your name and the outlet that you represent. So at this moment, we're inviting you to ask questions. Please raise your hand if you want to ask one. Antonio Broto from the EFE Spanish News Agency, please go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon. I would like to ask if you can elaborate a bit more on why the pandemic of COVID-19 has worsened the situation of child labor in all continents.
Yes, perhaps I can take that one. It's an important and very topical question. Well, I think there's a very clear and rather tragic logic to what is happening here. As I'm sure everybody is very aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has generated a crisis in the world of work. We've seen the equivalent of over 400 million jobs destroyed in the first half of this year. We've seen particularly those who fall outside the scope of social protection pushed from already precarious situations into situations of enormous vulnerability. I think of the informal economy where perhaps 1.6 billion people now face a destruction of their everyday livelihoods. And the problem is this: as vulnerability grows, as poverty increases, as the absence of income from normal work has dried up, well, families are looking for ways to supplement their incomes simply to survive. And in those circumstances, added to which the interruption of educational opportunities for many children, then the danger and the temptation of children being pushed into the market for child labor is correspondingly increased, and there is evidence that this is happening. So regrettably, one of the very many painful consequences of COVID-19 in the world of work is this increase in resort to child labor. And it is, as I think I said a few minutes ago, something which risks reversing the positive progress of recent years and decades.
Thanks, DG. Okay, we can take another question now. Please raise your hand if you'd like to take the floor. Antonio, you have a follow-up question. Please go ahead.
There are no more hands. Allow me to make another question. I would like to know if you can tell us a little about Latin American situation. Is this one of the regions where the improvement has stalled, or the numbers have been smaller in the recent years? Thank you.
Yeah, turning to the Americas, I think one thing I should underline in the first instance is that the Americas member states at the ILO have engaged very actively in the fight against child labor. The last global conference against child labor was hosted in Argentina. We have seen the creation of a global alliance precisely with the objective of making the Americas the first child labor-free continent of the world. So the political commitment has been really very strong. The figures today is that 5.3%, so a little bit more than 1 in 20 children in the Americas is in child labor. That means 10.7 million children in absolute terms, and 6.5 million of those are in hazardous work. So progress made, but a great deal that remains to be done. It's difficult for me to give you a figure or to give you a quantitative estimate on how COVID-19 has impacted upon the progress of the past and on these figures. But the reality is today, given the dynamics of the pandemic, that the Americas, in terms of COVID-19 infections, is the hardest hit region of all. That is reflected in the loss of jobs and working hours. I mentioned earlier on, I think, that the average loss of working time in the world in the first half of this year is 14%. In the Americas, it's at 18, just over 18%. So I think looking at these parameters, the danger must be that the Americas is particularly hard hit also in terms of the child labor situation. So again, this danger of the reversal of past progress is particularly acute in the Americas.
Sorry, yeah, Vera, you'd like to comment, please, go ahead.
Thank you, DG. Just to complement what DG is saying, is that we have also observed in the Americas some opportunities. And those opportunities that was brought by the COVID-19 crisis is that we have observed an increase on cash transfers to families with who are more vulnerable to the situation. And actually the amount given to the children, in the case of Brazil, is one of the examples, but also other countries like Mexico working hard on the cash transfers.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to the next question. It's Robin Millard from AFP. Please go ahead.
Hello there. Just a question on the timeline of ratification. When did this process start? How long has this taken? And on the historic nature of it, have any other conventions come very close to being fully ratified?
Well, the timeline's an easy one to answer. The convention was adopted in 1999, and ratification has been open since then. and we've finally got across the finishing line now. Now, that might seem like quite a long journey for most people. It is indeed quite a long journey. But the fact of the matter is that Convention 182, and this happened very early on after its adoption, became the most quickly ratified convention of all in ILO history. What about others? Well, we're not, I can't say we're on the threshold of universal ratification, but the ILO has 8 conventions that we consider fundamental conventions. They define human rights at work, if you like, universally accepted rights at work, which we expect our member states to promote regardless of whether, in fact, they've ratified the relevant conventions. They're supposed to work on the principles. And let me just enumerate to what those 8 conventions cover. They cover freedom of association, the right to organize and to collectively bargain, so basic trade union rights. They cover forced labor, freedom from forced labor, freedom from child labor, of course, and also elimination of discrimination at work in whatever form that might take. Now, this bundle of 8 conventions are all very highly ratified, and some of these are, I would say, within touching distance of universal ratification, and the ILO is working for that universal ratification, but it's unfinished business. There are still relatively small numbers, but still important numbers of our member states which have yet to ratify. In 1998, the ILO adopted a very important declaration on fundamental principles and rights at work, where we established this universal obligation to work to implement the principles of these conventions. At that time, we launched a global campaign for universal ratification. 182 is the first ripe fruit of that campaign, and we'll be pushing for the others to follow.
Okay, next question. It's Lisa, I believe it's Lisa Schlein from Voice of America. Please go ahead.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. I'd like to ask you a bit about Africa. You seem to indicate that progress in eliminating or stopping the practice of child labor, the most hazardous forms, has stalled. I'd like to know, first of all, how large a problem is it on the continent, and why has it stalled? And do you have any recommendations for getting it restarted? And on that, and then the second question has to do with the enforcement by states of prohibitions against child labor. Do you find that they generally are not strong enough? What are the main impediments to stopping this practice?
Okay, thank you for those 2 questions. Let me have a first go at them, and I'm sure Veeral can add some more detail to what I have to say. Yeah, Africa. There is a particular focus of our attention on Africa. You asked for the numbers. Well, they're worrying. In absolute terms, just over 72 million African children are in child labor, and of those, 31.5 million in hazardous work. The prevalence rate then is nearly 20%. Nearly 1 in 5 of all African children are in child labor. So you can see that the numbers are worrying. But not just that, so are the trends. As I said in my earlier presentation, progress seems to have stalled in Africa, and child labor in absolute terms actually increased in sub-Saharan Africa from 2012 to 2016. I think Vera can give you greater insight into the dynamics in Africa, where Vera's worked extensively. What about implementation and enforcement? Well, it's really important that I underline that whilst we really welcome the ratification, the formal acceptance of legal obligations under an ILO convention by a country, we welcome ratification. We have no illusions. Ratification is a starting point very often. What actually matters is the implementation of a convention. We have a fairly elaborate and well-developed system of supervision in the ILO. I mentioned it earlier on, whereby countries are required to report periodically and can be subjected to complaints where they appear to be failing to respect a convention. But yes, there are impediments. What are those impediments? Well, I think we have to look in the first instance at simply inadequate institutional capacities in a number of countries. Labour inspection processes and the like are not always effective. It's very important in that regard to mobilise communities, to make child labour in the eyes of the population absolutely unacceptable. And there needs to be strong social values and norms, I think, applied to these situations. We also know that a great deal of child labour is in the agricultural sector, it's in the informal sector, it's often in family farming settings. These are often difficult to reach settings, and I think this too is illustrative of some of the obstacles and difficulties that we face. I do think that it's important to understand that given the complexities of child labour and the causal factors behind child labour, we have to see that there are a number of ingredients that have to come together in effective national action programs against child labour. Educational opportunity and access to affordable quality education matters a great deal. Income support and social protection matters a great deal. Yes, institutional capacity of governments matters as well. Social attitudes matters. Mobilization of community action matters. So all of these things have to be brought together. Vera, perhaps you can supplement.
Thank you, DG. Just to complement what the DG is saying, and starting with what he said about the social, I would start to say for Africa, we move a long way from not accepting the existence of child labor, but also now to accept that there is child labor, there is worst form of child labor, and that is possible to draw on what we have learned. I think we also come to the situation where we have been doing so much on knowledge process. So having the surveys at the country level so we can identify what are the regions, what are the sub-regions, but also how can a national action plan is not drawing only on child labor, but also at the level of education, access to education, access for children, but in particular girls. And I would say Africa is being, of course, more eaten because they are most affected by fragility. We have a lot of situations of fragile states, but also the inequality that we have been observing. But I think for the last couple of years, we have made a lot of progress with the ratification of the Convention 182. African member states are the first ones to ratify, but also last year with the adoption of the African Union Action Plan on Child Labor. And this adoption has provided us and do provide us with an opportunity to work not only at the regional level, but also at the sub-regional level and at country levels. And also Africa is being on forefront establishing the list of hazardous work, which is one of also the good examples that child labor is not only being seen as something that is not internalized, but is something that the countries are being taken care of.
Okay, let me also ask Corinne Varga, the director of our International Labor Standards Department, to comment on this question as well. Corinne, you can go ahead, please.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, on this important question of enforcement, I just wanted to highlight one specificity of our organization. When you have a country that's ratifying a convention, it commits itself to doing two things. One is to implement it nationally, and secondly, to accept international regular supervision of how it is implementing and abiding by its international obligation. So this means that for a convention as important as this one, every 3 years, a given country will have to submit a report which is going to be examined by a totally independent body of 20 experts. And so these experts will identify progress made and how compliant a given country is. And the whole idea here is not solely to identify problems for the sake of identifying problems, but for the sake of stimulating action to address this problem and redress these problems, including through ILO Technical Cooperation Program, as my colleague Vera mentioned. So the organization is active on these two fronts, monitoring to ensure that there is enforcement and compliance, and yet offering support where difficulties are encountered. So by this dual action, we're generating a virtuous circle of progress towards certainly compliance with labor standards, but towards decent work generally. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Corinne. Let's go to the next question, and it's the turn of Peter Kenny. Peter, please go ahead.
No.
Peter, are you there? No. Okay, so let me ask a question that came in through the group chat, and in a way it's related to what was just discussed, but let me ask it again. In any case, it comes from the German radio ARD, and it says, could you please elaborate a bit on the technical side on how the convention is operated, put in practice by countries? For example, children in the Congolese mines, will they benefit from the convention once a law has been established by the government?
Yeah. Yes, I'll be asking Corinne later to comment on the process of the conventions. But yes, we do have, and what she mentioned about monitoring the system when convention is ratified. But in this case, since it's a convention that is a fundamental one, even if the country doesn't ratify, which is not the case here, the country is obliged to provide information on how is adapting its legislation to have accommodating what the convention says. The support that ILO been providing is to work with the country on tackling the issue on mining by strengthening the capacity, but also to identify where are the children, and to put in place a system that we can monitor and support decent work for adults, so those children can be withdrawn from the worst form of child labor. Maybe Corinne wants to come in on the conventions.
Corinne, are you there?
I am.
Yeah, come in, please.
Yeah, no, thank you, Martin. And yes, indeed, I mean, to answer specifically the question, yes, the children in the Congolese mine will be benefiting from the protection of the convention as from the moment the Congo has ratified that convention. So that's the legal protection. Now the challenge comes in terms of how is this applied in practice, right? And this calls for a wide range of combined action, inspection, supervision, and so responsibility fully undertaken by the government, but also by all the actors in the community, because fighting child labor in this difficult context calls for, it is a collective responsibility. So national actors, wide range of national actors will have to stand up to that responsibility. But I would also say the international community. I'm not sure what kind of mines you were referring to, but there are instances where these mines, the products of these mines, if we think in gold or diamond, are then being sold into the international market, and there is also an international responsibility of ensuring that we are conscious when we buying products that can potentially be produced by children as well.
Okay. I see Peter Kenny is back online. Peter, can you hear us?
Can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, DG, thank you very much for your remarks. It appears from them that there's a huge chasm between, the implementation of the treaty and the ratification of the treaty. Could you just elaborate a bit on why such treaties are important when they seem, you know, to the outside person, they might sort of say, well, they don't appear to be working at all.
I understand, and this, I think the question follows up quite directly from the last exchange. The treaties, these conventions, I mean, they really do make a difference. We have seen, and it's largely due to international campaign work built upon ILO conventions, we have seen a really very important reduction in child labor in all of its forms since the 1990s, I would say, by about 1/3, more than 1/3. So you're right to point to, you've called it a chasm. We still have a massive challenge ahead of us. 152 million children still in child labor, and something like half of those in the worst forms of child labor. Now, I think you're right to say, well, you know, what value these legal protections if there are still so many children in these unacceptable conditions? Well, look, there are no silver bullets in this world. The point here is, I think, that when a country takes on legal obligations, and that's what an ILO convention is, to act in a certain way to eliminate the worst forms of child labor, that gives us real leverage. That gives us, and it also gives the national stakeholders, real leverage to make progress. It does not mean, and despite everything, it does not mean that the act of ratification automatically and immediately eliminates the problem to be addressed. It doesn't. But it gives us traction, it gives us instruments, and it gives us opportunity to accelerate progress, and that progress is already being made. I think also an act of ratification is an act of political will and commitment. I think for a long time, there was a feeling that somehow child labor is an inevitable and automatic concomitant of poverty and underdevelopment in the world. Well, the fact of the matter is that by conscious efforts to address and eliminate child labor, regardless of the level of development at which countries are, progress can be made. And there are countries at comparable levels of development with very different levels of child labor. So we need to get out of, and I think we are out of, this sort of feeling that there is something fatalistic about the prevalence of child labor. So the ratification, sort of to resume all of this, is an instrument, it's an opportunity, it's leverage, but it requires effort behind it. It requires governments to take up their responsibilities. It requires our social partners, employers and workers, to undertake their responsibilities. And it requires a type of community mobilization, which has been talked about already. And I'm very clear that the job of the ILO is not to catch out member states in contravention of ILO conventions. It's to help and assist and to accompany our member states to come into compliance. Now, sometimes that can lead to some fairly sharp-edged conversations with our member states, so be it. But in general, I think it leads to a development and a tightening of partnerships to take us where we need to get to. So these things really do make a difference, an enormous difference, but they're not the magic bullet, and nobody would pretend that they are.
Okay, I don't see any other raised hands, but if you do have any questions, please do raise your hands. Now is the moment. Okay, so we'll stop right here. I want to thank you for taking part in this press briefing. Like the DG said, it's an historic day for the ILO. The embargo will lift in 21 minutes. And if you have any follow-up questions, or if you'd like to do any more interviews, please do get in touch with us at newsroom@ilo.org, and we'd be happy to follow up on those requests. Thanks a lot. Thank you, DG, Vera, and Corinne. And I hope you have a nice rest of the day. Bye for now.